Hello everyone. All right, so for this video, we are going to walk through social movements. Right? So social movements are a form of collective action. Um, Collective action is just an umbrella term for efforts that are engaged in by groups of people to address problematic conditions, formulate responses to ambiguous situations. We've talked a little bit about collective behavior, things like riots and panics and rumors. Previously, that's collective behavior. The difference between collective behavior and social movements as a form of collective action is that the former are spontaneous, right? They just kind of arise in the moment. Social movements, on the other hand, are planned. All of them fit under that umbrella of collective action, but spontaneous collective action is called collective behavior. Organized and intentional collective action is called social movement. So a social movement is defined as a collection of individuals who organize together to achieve or to prevent social or political change. There are three types of social movements. I'm going to list them here from the most to least common, and then talk a little bit about why that is. The most common form of social movement is what we call a reform movement. This is a collective action that seeks to change limited aspects of society, but is not seeking to alter or replace major social institutions. So a reform movement is kind of small scale. Resistance movements are collective actions that are designed to prevent or to sometimes reverse changes that are sought or accomplished by an earlier social movement, specifically a reform movement. And then finally, revolutionary movements are collective action that attempts to overthrow an entire social system and replace it with another. So the reason why these go from most to least common, reform, resistance, revolution, is that while it is relatively easy to get people to agree that some aspect of their society needs to be changed, right? That would align with what we mean when we talk about reform movements. It's very difficult to get a sufficient number of people to agree that everything needs to be changed and replaced with something else, which would be what we get in a revolution. So that explains why reform movements are more common than revolutionary movements, but it doesn't necessarily explain why resistance movements aren't at least as common as reform movements. And the reason why resistance movements are not as common as reform movements is that not all reforms are things that are going to produce pushback. Some people like the reform, and at the end of the day, there isn't a serious effort to sort of roll it back. So remember, a resistance movement is only going to occur in response to an already existing or even previously successful resistance movement or a reform movement. But if the reforms are popular, then there's going to be no reason for people to kind of organize a resistance to that, which is why you will never have more resistance movements than you would reform movements. And in fact, you are almost always going to have, no, I shouldn't say that, scratch that. You are always going to have more reform movements than resistance movements. So those are the three types, reform, resistance, revolution, in order from most frequent to least. Now, whether we are talking about a reform movement, a resistance movement, or a revolutionary movement, we are going to see that all social movements have 5 necessary elements. So when we talk about necessary, it's not just a word that we're using. This actually has a concrete meaning attached to it. So a little bit of a tangent here, but I'll explain. It will help explain sort of what I'm getting at here. So there are conditions that are necessary, and there are conditions that are sufficient. A necessary condition is one that has to be present, but by itself is not enough. A sufficient condition also has to be present, but by itself is enough. Right? So none of these conditions that I'm about to describe are sufficient, but all of them are necessary. So in other words, you have to have all of these for a social movement to be successful, whether we are talking about a reform movement, a resistance movement, or a revolution. All right, so what's the first element necessary for a successful social movement? Well, there has to be something that inspires it, right? There has to be something that leads people to want to create some degree of social change, something that they are unhappy about. Strain, in other words, there has to be some kind of strain. The strain could be that a previously existing reform movement has accomplished something that members of a particular subculture or social group find morally repugnant or undesirable, and they want to kind of roll that back. It could be a set of conditions in which people finally say, we've had enough, we're done with monarchies, we're going to kill the king and his queen and all of the members of court, and we're going to establish a constitutional democracy to replace the monarchy, and you get a revolution. Right? But the point here is that some kind of strain has to exist for people to come together, for people to try to create some kind of alteration, some kind of change in society. One of the most common forms of strain, and one that typically leads to reform movements, is something we call relative deprivation. So relative deprivation is just a sense that some people have access to a resource or a reward or something in society that you feel entitled to, but that you don't have. You are relatively deprived of this thing that other people have. So one of the first things that has to happen for that sense of relative deprivation to even possibly result in a successful social movement is you have to find other people who share that sense of deprivation. It has to become a social phenomenon. It can't just be that I'm unhappy. You have to find other people who are experiencing a similar kind of unhappiness. And from that shared sense of deprivation, that shared sense of grievance, one of the things that might happen is that the people who are experiencing that might sort of organize themselves together to think of ways to maybe alter that, to change that in a way that's beneficial to them. So strain has to be present for people to want to change society. Now, strain is really interesting. You would think that hitting rock bottom in whatever analogy you want to create, right? Getting to the absolute worst set of conditions would be the thing that would produce a social movement. But actually, it's when conditions improve slightly, right? So when people are completely deprived of something, it often does not result in the coalescing of people around an issue or a desire to create change. It's when things are really, really bad and they get slightly better, seems to be what sort of sparks a lot of social movements, because what happens in that moment is people realize things can improve. They're unhappy with the degree to which they haven't fully improved, but they've begun to realize that things could get better. And when they realize that things could get better, that creates some inertia, that creates some momentum toward actually coalescing around an issue and trying to create some kind of reform movement. And once you have people together experiencing this strain, understanding that it's not something that they have to be stuck with, that they could actually address that in some way that improves their circumstances and the circumstances of others, you get to the second necessary element for a successful social movement, which is what we call ideology. Now, ideology is a set of interconnected beliefs and attitudes that are shared and utilized by members of a group or by a movement that not only offer explanations, but also solutions regarding social issues. Now, there's a lot there, but if you think about sort of what it means at its core, the ideology is what legitimizes the social movement to the members of that movement, right? It explains It offers up a set of explanations for why this set of circumstances exist in the first place. It identifies responsible parties. It suggests courses of action and the things that we should do to address this issue around which we're organizing our movement. So think of ideology as the way that a movement sells itself to itself, right? It's the internal understandings, it's the internal justifications, it's the internal legitimacy that an organization takes and uses as a kind of stepping off point, right? Here's what's wrong, here's who's responsible for what's wrong, and here's how we're going to fix it. So that's ideology. The third necessary element for a successful social movement is framing. So if ideology is about how you sell the movement to members of the movement, framing is about how the movement sort of presents itself to the broader public. So framing, broadly understood, means locating, perceiving, identifying, and labeling events in ways that create meaning, organize experience, and guide actions. Again, to the people outside the movement. There are a bunch of different strategies that people use when framing their movements. What you really want to do, you really want to accomplish one of two things. You want to get people to support what you're doing, or, barring that, you want to persuade them not to resist, right? The one thing a reform movement does not want is an energized resistance movement. So the members of a movement, as they communicate their movement's identity to people not yet in the movement, are going to do so in such a way that they want to get people who are not yet in the movement to join up. If we can't get them to join up, then the members of a movement will say, we at least want to neutralize any potential opposition. So the strategies that are used for framing include things like frame alignment, frame bridging, and frame resonance. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these. You don't need to be deeply familiar with them, but I'd like you to have some passing familiarity. So frame alignment happens when a movement aligns their ideology. Remember that set of explanatory narratives and responsible parties and objectives, right? So they want to align their ideology with the attitudes of potential recruits and a broader public, right? So again, we want other people out there to see the way in which our movement aligns with things that they already possess, attitudes and beliefs and understandings that they already possess. So if, in the United States, we as a society place a tremendous amount of value on freedom, right? As a social and cultural value, freedom has a lot of weight. It has a lot of sort of built-in sort of appeal, right? People from a very early age are socialized to value freedom and to engage in a set of normative behaviors that presumably reflect that underlying value. So from the get-go, freedom is a general positive in terms of how it's sold to the public through socialization. So given that the public value freedom as a social value, if you are able to show them that your movement is about freedom, then you've already kind of got them on board, right? Because they've already committed to freedom, right? They're already on board with this. What you need to do as a social movement, I don't really mean you as an individual person, what a social movement needs to do then in framing itself is make it clear how their movement advances this value of freedom, or is organized around this value of freedom, or is a response to some threat to freedom, right? Because freedom is a thing that people already buy into. You as a movement only need people to see that your movement is about that thing. Then they realize they're already on board. So that's what frame alignment is. Getting people to see a social movement as already consistent with positions they hold, They don't need to be convinced. They just need to be shown. That's a little bit different than frame bridging. Frame bridging reflects a movement's shift to a frame where personal involvement in this collective action is seen as the answer to the problem, right? We can't do this without you, becomes the message when a movement is attempting to engage in frame bridging, right? That this movement isn't something that's going to happen and then you're going to benefit from. It can't happen unless you get involved, right? So the messages that the movement shares with the broader public who are not yet involved in the movement is to say, you know, we depend on you. We need you. You've got to be part of this. The last type of framing, or the last strategy around framing, is what we call frame resonance. And frame resonance is when a movement creates a deep connection between their frame and the experiences of actual or potential recruits, to show people that they are already kind of connected to this movement through their own experiences. I thought that, you know, if you look at Occupy Wall Street back in 2011, that movement had a really resonant message in how they described themselves as the 99%, right? We are the 99% was the slogan that they would chant as they marched, you know, in demonstrations, as they occupied public spaces to draw attention to the inequities in response to the economic collapse of 2008 and 2009. They were pointing out that you know, banks and large corporate interests had gotten bailed out. They'd gotten favorable treatment from the government, but everybody else was kind of getting screwed. They were the victims of an economic downturn that they were not responsible for, and yet they were the ones paying the price for it. And by trying to frame the Occupy movement as one in which all of us are kind of collectively you know, victimized by the sort of the preference for supporting and helping Wall Street at the expense of Main Street, you can see those efforts of that movement of Occupy Wall Street to sort of create that deep connection between their movement and you know, the broader public, which might not have necessarily seen themselves as part of that movement. So that's the third necessary element. The fourth necessary element is what we call resource mobilization. Resource mobilization is basically when a movement collects and assembles money and members and media attention and other resources that are needed by the movement. And there's a theory. It's almost laughably obvious. I'm not even sure that it stands as a theory, but there is a theory, and they call it a theory, so you know, we kind of have to acknowledge it. But there is a theory called resource mobilization theory that says that access to resources is crucial to an aspiring movement, and that movements can only grow when a committed group of individuals is willing to acquire and use resources on its behalf. That's basically a way of saying a movement only succeeds when it succeeds, which is kind of, like I said, I'm not quite sure why this is a thing that people sort of draw attention to. It seems really, really obvious that social movements that don't get attention, social movements that can't accrue media focus or gain membership or articulate their agenda to a broader public is not going to succeed. And the answer to that is, well, of course not. But nevertheless, resource mobilization theory aside, it is important that movements be able to sort of organize the assemblage of things like membership and media attention and other resources, money and whatnot, because those things are really, really important in both continuing to sort of firm up and share the ideology within the group, but more importantly, the efforts to bridge, the efforts to align frames, the efforts to create that deep sort of resonance that's built around framing. That is something that is going to require significant resources. And so, not surprisingly, collecting and assembling those things becomes really, really essential to the success of a movement. And then the last element is what we call opportunity structures. Now, opportunity structures come in two forms, right? There are what we call cultural opportunities, and there are political opportunities. So a cultural opportunity occurs when there's a shift in popular ideas, and the shift in popular ideas makes it possible to change how a particular troubling condition is addressed. A political opportunity is a situation in which there's a shift in power that makes it possible to change how a troubling condition gets addressed. So I'm going to use Occupy Wall Street because I've already kind of mentioned it once, but Occupy Wall Street is a manifestation in some ways of a much deeper and longer standing social movement that's present in the United States, and that is a movement toward economic equality. And it's cropped up. That undercurrent of economic inequality has been at the core of a lot of different movements. It's been at the core of, for example, the civil rights movement. It's been at the core of movements within efforts by economically disenfranchised groups of people to sort of leverage improved conditions. So think of the Black Power movement, or think of the Chicano movement, or the American Indian movement as examples of efforts to address discrimination and inequality built around racial or ethnic identity, in the same way that the equal rights movement for women, the women's movement as it's broadly called, or feminism, and feminism's kind of divided up into sort of waves of feminism, but at the core of all of these movements is an effort to address a form of economic inequality, often along sort of ascriptive identities like race or sex, or ethnicity. So when we look at Occupy Wall Street, it's just kind of the latest version of that movement, or one of the latest versions of that movement. So the economic inequality movement, or the economic equality movement, it's not a movement to create inequality, it's a movement to address inequality. So let's call it the economic equality movement. The economic equality movement had a moment when, in the wake of the collapse of the economy in 2008 and 2009, people were really angry. People were reminded of sort of the stark inequalities that existed between corporate interests in Wall Street and sort of everyday mainstream American interests, right? So there's a moment there where some of the deeply ingrained flaws of capitalism get exposed in a way that they previously had not been. And people were in a moment of flux. People were questioning the legitimacy of a system in which, you work hard, you pay your bills, you do everything right, and you should get a reward, because that's kind of the way that the American dream gets sold to most people, is you play by the rules and things are going to work out well for you. But here come these bankers and these actors within the financial sector who crashed the economy. They did nothing right, but not only did they get bailed out, they got to keep their bonuses. And of course, in the meantime, right, regular rank and file Americans are losing their jobs, their homes are getting foreclosed on, right? All of these other things are happening to them. So that creates a moment in how people think about, in this case, the organization and operation of the economy. And Occupy Wall Street comes along and says, here are the forces that are to blame. Here's why you should feel, and you are entitled to feel, kind of legitimately screwed by all of this. So there was a cultural opportunity in that moment that the economic inequality, economic equality movement broadly was able to sort of capitalize on. It also happened to coincide with a political opportunity. Now, political opportunities, unlike cultural opportunities, tend to be a little bit more predictable. We know with stunning regularity when our elections are going to be. It's one of the few things about politics in this country that we really have any sense of certainty about, which is when we are going to have elections. So we knew that in 2008 that there was going to be a presidential election. And in that presidential election, we knew that the previous administration, the administration of George W. Bush, was going to be replaced, right? We knew that because George W. Bush was term limited. He had been elected in 2004 to a second term in office. You're only allowed 2 terms in office according to the Constitution. So we knew that in 2008, there was going to be a new president. Now, the new president could have been a new president from the political party of the former president. In other words, we could have elected another Republican, in which case it would have been John McCain and his running mate Sarah Palin. Or it was going to be a candidate that represented the Democratic Party, in which case it was going to be Barack Obama and his running mate Joe Biden. So we knew that there was going to be a shift in power. Even changing from a Democratic administration to a different Democratic administration, or a Republican administration to a different Republican administration, is still a shift in power. It's a moment when there's kind of a whole set of new opportunities because the old regime is being replaced with a new regime. So in 2008, not only did we go from one president to a new president, we went from a president from one party to a president of a different party. And just to make it, even more poignant, the president that we elected was named Barack Hussein Obama, and he had the amazing sort of quality of being our first black president in the history of this country. So the idea that there's a moment here where possibility sort of suddenly springs into existence where there weren't really possibilities before, combined with the economic collapse that sort of took place around the time of the election, there were both cultural and political opportunities that movements like Occupy Wall Street could take advantage of. So the supplemental readings that you're reading by Gupta and Levitin kind of explore the degree to which that either happened or didn't happen, depending on a variety of things. I tend to be of the opinion that Occupy Wall Street as a movement did not succeed, but that the economic equality movement broadly certainly made significant gains. And we can talk about why that is in class, but it is really, really interesting to sort of look at Occupy Wall Street and that particular moment as a kind of manifestation of a number of the elements that we've talked about with regard to what makes for a successful social movement. So that again kind of gives you a nice overview, and the chapter again and the supplemental readings will kind of deeply and more fully elaborate on all of that. And of course, I look forward to having conversations about this stuff with you guys in class. So until then, I'll just say take care.